and gentlemen, at this time we would like to continue with the recognition of the senior members of the band, color guard, and majorettes, along with their parents or escorts. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the senior students and parents for the time and effort that has been put into making this an outstanding organization. Please hold your applause until all have been introduced. Beverly Kelm and Mr. Roger Albright. David Bales, son of Mr. and Mrs. Donald Bales. Annette Barnhart, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Barnhart. Maureen Bayura, color guard captain, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Bayura. Marcy Bellish, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edward Bellish. Al Baranek, son of Mr. and Mrs. John Baranek. Linda Sue Bischoff, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Donald Bischoff. Susie Boydum, daughter of Ed and Joan Boydum. Sherry Bullabush, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lynn Bullabush. Anne Elizabeth Cole, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Cole. Lana Kramer, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Kramer. Ed Cunnard, son of Mrs. Pat Cunnard. Gina D'Amico, daughter of Regina and Frank D'Amico. Kristen Durick, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Steve Durick. Jennifer Fisher, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Fisher. Melissa Lynn Fornell, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Fornell. Hope Geyer, daughter of James Geyer and accompanied along with sister Denise. Patricia Greer, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Irvin Greer. Linda R. Howe, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn Howe. Jennifer Hauptman, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Hauptman. Jennifer Jaworski, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Jaworski. Becky Johnson, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ken Johnson. Susie Kessler, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Blaine Kessler. Diane Keita, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Keita. Jackie Kovacina, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rudy Kovacina. Lori Kreisinger, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Regis Kreisinger. Valerie Jean Laufer, majorette captain, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Howard Laufer. Mark E. Levison, son of Dr. and Mrs. William D. Levison, unable to attend tonight. Tracy Ludwig, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Chester Ludwig. Amy Jo Lynch, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Lynch. Joseph Manella, son of Mr. and Mrs. Julian Manella. Sally Ann Mays, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James E. Mays. Melanie McGiffin, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wilmer McGiffin. Jennifer Lee Malego, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Malego. Annette Meow, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Vincent Meow. Rhonda Lee Mondock, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Mondock. Christine Muma, daughter of Reverend and Mrs. Neil Muma. Blaine Niederheiser, son of Mrs. Robert Niederheiser. Linda Permuka, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Permuka. Lisa Pekowski, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Pekowski. Karen Angela Ponko, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edmund Ponko. Teresa Puskar, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jack Pushkar. Barry Rodman, field director, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jean Rodman. Louis Rosenstiel, son of Al and Paul Rosenstiel. Cheryl Rosenko, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Rosenko. Roberta Schaefer, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert G. Schaefer. Lisa Marie Strednak, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ray Strednak. Karen Lynn Swiderski, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Swiderski. Twyla Dawn Slozek, daughter of Elsie and Joseph Slozek Sr. Sean E. Underwood, son of Mr. and Mrs. Homer E. Underwood. David Weinstein, son of Linda Weinstein, escorted by Richard Gerechter, uncle. Paula Yashika, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nicholas Yashika. Dave Uhouse, son of Mr. and Mrs. Julius Uhouse. Denise Zoronsky, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Zoronsky. Ladies and gentlemen, can we now have a big round of applause for the seniors and their parents. Band.